They asked the question in a chamber built older than most stars, beneath a ceiling etched with the victories of extinct civilizations, and they asked it with the calm certainty of beings who had never truly been afraid. The human delegation stood alone at the center of the grand conclave, one figure among thousands of alien representatives, while the presiding speaker of the Varelian Synod leaned forward and voiced what half the galaxy had whispered for centuries. Why, the speaker asked, does humanity never strike first? The question echoed through translation fields and diplomatic relays, carried to listening posts and civilian feeds across inhabited space. And for a moment, the galaxy leaned in. Humanity had been at war before, everyone knew that. Devastating wars, efficient wars, wars that ended with enemy flags burning and entire empires quietly vanishing from the star charts. Yet in every recorded case, humanity had waited. They had absorbed insults, blockades, border raids, even massacres, and still they waited. To the older powers, to the ancient empires that measured dominance in millennia, this restraint looked like fear dressed up as morality. It looked like hesitation. It looked like weakness. The speaker's frilled crest pulsed with smug bioluminescence as he finished the question and gestured to the lone human representative. The feed zoomed in, and somewhere out there, maybe you were listening too, wondering what answer could possibly satisfy a galaxy that believed it had finally understood humans. The human who stepped forward was not a general or an admiral. He carried no medals, wore no uniform, and his hands were empty. He was old, gray-haired, and walked with the slight stiffness of someone who had lived long enough to remember wars other people preferred to forget. The name introduced to the conclave translated imperfectly, but closest in standard was Historian Elias Rook, archivist of the United Earth Memory Office. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout because it expected to be heard. He thanked the conclave for the question, and for a heartbeat the speaker looked confused, as if gratitude had not been part of the script. Rook then did something unexpected. He asked permission to answer with a story. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, but permission was granted. After all, what harm could a story do? Rook began not with humanity's rise, but with its first great silence. He spoke of a time nearly 400 years earlier, when humans had only just begun to step beyond their home system, when their ships were fragile and their colonies few. He described the Exari Dominion, an empire so old it had forgotten the taste of defeat, whose fleets darkened entire sectors, and whose doctrine was simple: strike first, strike hard, erase resistance before it could grow. When the Exari encountered a human colony on the edge of unclaimed space, they did what they had always done. They attacked without warning. They burned orbital habitats, glassed settlements, and transmitted the footage as a warning to anyone else who might dream of expansion. The conclave listened, some with mild interest, others with boredom. Ancient empires had done worse. Then Rook showed the aftermath. He showed human evacuation ships overloaded with refugees. He showed emergency councils convened in underground chambers on Earth. And he showed something else, too, something the galaxy had never been shown before. He showed the decision. Humanity did not retaliate immediately. Instead, they documented everything, every transmission, every energy signature, every tactical maneuver the Exari used. They recorded the names of the dead. They recorded the faces of the children who didn't make it onto the evacuation ships. They recorded, and they waited. When the conclave asked why, Rook answered simply that humanity was learning. He explained that humans, unlike most species, did not forget pain once it passed. They cataloged it. They studied it. They built around it. And when they finally moved 3 years later, they did not send a punitive strike or a warning fleet. They sent accountants. They sent analysts. They sent planners who mapped the Exari supply chains, their political fractures, their cultural fault lines. Only then did the fleets move. The flashback ended with a silent star system. The Axari homeworld still orbited its sun, intact, untouched, but everything else was gone. Every shipyard dismantled, every military installation neutralized, every allied client state quietly severed through economic collapse and engineered political implosion. The Axari dominion did not fall in a blaze of glory, it suffocated. Its fleets found their fuel depots empty, its admirals discovered their orders countermanded by governments that no longer existed, and within a decade, the empire that had terrorized half a spiral arm voted itself into irrelevance. Rook paused there, letting the image linger, and somewhere in the audience a junior delegate swallowed hard. This was not the kind of war recorded in heroic murals. This was something colder. The speaker interrupted then, his tone sharp with irritation, suggesting that this only proved humanity was slow to act, that faster species would have ended the threat sooner. Rook nodded, as if conceding the point, and then asked a question of his own. How many civilizations, he asked, had the speaker personally witnessed go extinct? The chamber fell quiet. The speaker did not answer. Rook continued anyway. He spoke of the Keth ascendancy, a hive mind species that believed preemptive annihilation was the highest form of security. They struck first against humanity during a trade summit, unleashing a bioweapon intended to erase Earth's population in days. Humanity lost billions. The galaxy expected a retaliatory genocide. What followed instead was silence. No fleet movements, no declarations, no rage-filled broadcasts, just silence. And then, over the next 20 years, the Keth discovered their genetic libraries corrupted, their reproduction cycles destabilized, their hive queens failing one by one. Humanity had not attacked the Keth worlds, they had edited them. When the last Keth consciousness faded, there were no human ships in orbit, no monuments raised, just empty planets and a single archived file labeled Containment Complete. By now, the conclave chamber was no longer relaxed. Representatives shifted in their seats. Some began quietly transmitting messages to their home systems. Rook's voice remained steady as he explained that humans had learned something early in their history, something written into every military doctrine and ethical charter since. Violence, once unleashed, reshapes the one who uses it. Strike first often enough, and eventually striking becomes the only answer you know. Humanity chose restraint not because it was easy, but because it was the last barrier between them and becoming something the galaxy would not survive. He looked directly into the primary camera then, as if addressing not just the conclave, but everyone listening beyond it, and said that humanity waits because waiting gives their enemies a chance to stop, a chance to live. He ended the first part of his answer with a revelation that sent a ripple of unease through every empire present. Humanity, he said, maintains a classified archive known informally as the Ledger. It contains the names of every civilization that forced humans to abandon restraint. Some of those names, he added softly, no longer corresponded to anyone living. The speaker attempted to regain control of the chamber, to reframe the narrative, but the damage was done. The question had not revealed cowardice, it had revealed a patience that bordered on the terrifying. And as Rook prepared to continue, alarms flared quietly in distant systems, triggered by old human beacons waking from dormancy, reminding the galaxy that stories like these were not told for entertainment alone. Somewhere, a line was being tested again.
The historian did not pause because he needed time, but because he wanted the galaxy to feel the weight of what had already been said, and when he continued, it was without changing his tone, as if he were discussing weather rather than extinction. He told them that the ledger was not symbolic, not a myth whispered to frighten cadets, but a living archive updated in real time, and that every human warship, every intelligence core, every strategic AI carried a mirrored fragment of it, so that no matter where humanity stood, it remembered exactly why it stood there. He spoke next of the Talaran Compact, a coalition of elder races who believed themselves wiser than humans and decided restraint could be exploited, who imposed sanctions, seized human assets, and quietly funded proxy attacks along human borders while smiling through diplomatic summits, assuming humans would absorb the pressure as they always had. Humanity protested, negotiated, compromised, and waited, and the compact mistook patience for paralysis. When the first human colony starved because relief convoys were delayed, when the first civilian transport vanished in a compact-controlled corridor, the waiting ended, but not with fleets. Instead, compact trade algorithms began failing in small ways that looked like glitches. Shipping insurance collapsed. Member worlds turned on each other as ancient grievances resurfaced. And by the time compact admirals realized they were under attack, there was no enemy to fire upon, only collapsing economies and governments begging humanity to stop doing whatever it was doing. Humanity did not issue demands. They simply restored normal function once the compact dissolved itself and publicly apologized, and the galaxy learned that day that humans could dismantle empires without ever crossing a border. The historian then revealed something even more unsettling, that humanity had modeled every known civilization, run projections across thousands of possible conflicts, and identified exactly which species would collapse under pressure and which would escalate to annihilation, and that this knowledge was the true reason humans never attacked first, because once a line was crossed, there was no uncertainty left, no chance for misunderstanding, no ambiguity to restrain what followed. He described how human children were taught this not as propaganda, but as history, how they learned the names of worlds that no longer existed, not with pride, but with warning, and how the phrase "never again" was not a rallying cry, but a promise carved into policy. Somewhere in the chamber, a delegate asked what would happen if two civilizations crossed that line at once, and Rook answered without hesitation that humanity had already planned for that too. The conclave grew colder as he explained that restraint was not passive, it was active containment, a conscious choice repeated every day by a species capable of ending wars before they began and choosing not to unless forced, because the moment humanity struck first, it would justify every fear the galaxy had ever whispered about them. He reminded them that humans lived fast, felt deeply, bonded fiercely, and grieved violently, and that when those traits were weaponized without restraint, entire regions of space went quiet. The historian's eyes hardened then, just slightly, as he said that humanity preferred enemies alive, not out of mercy, but out of discipline, because dead enemies taught no lessons, but living ones remembered. He ended by answering the original question at last, directly and without ornament, saying humans never attacked first because once they started, there would be no second chances, no rebuilding, no balance restored, only an ending written so thoroughly that history itself would forget what had been erased. And as the chamber absorbed that truth, news feeds across the galaxy began to report sudden emergency sessions, fleets recalled to defensive postures, and ancient war plans quietly shelved, because the question had been answered, and the answer was not comforting. And somewhere far from the conclave, deep in a restricted human archive, a dormant entry in the ledger flickered briefly, as if acknowledging that the universe had been reminded once more why humanity waited.
The chambers should have adjourned after that. Protocol demanded it. But no one moved because the fear had shifted into something worse, curiosity mixed with dread. And the speaker realized too late that once a human historian started explaining, stopping him was no longer an option. Rook continued by revealing that restraint had not always been humanity's choice, that in their earliest interstellar years they had believed, foolishly, that transparency and goodwill alone could protect them, and he showed the conclave archival footage of the Helior incident, a moment carefully omitted from most galactic records. A human exploration flotilla, unarmed by design, had entered Helior space broadcasting peaceful intent, carrying scientists, diplomats, and families meant to establish first cultural exchange. The Helior matriarchy interpreted this not as peace, but as an opportunity, striking immediately, boarding the ships, dissecting crews alive to study human biology, and transmitting the experiments as proof of dominance. Humanity's response did not come that year, nor the next. It came 17 years later, when Helior leaders had grown complacent, when their defenses were optimized against fleets, not inevitability. Human code infiltrated Helior planetary systems disguised as medical aid software, rewriting atmospheric processors molecule by molecule until the air itself became unbreathable to Helior physiology and harmless to everything else. No bombardment, no invasion, just the slow realization that their world was killing them and that there was no fix, because humanity had already mapped every countermeasure before deploying the first line of code. Rook explained that after Helior, humanity rewrote its entire strategic philosophy, embedding a principle so absolute it bordered on religion: never act from fear, never act from pride, and never act first, because the first strike was emotional, and emotion led to waste. Precision required patience. Somewhere in the conclave, a representative demanded to know how many civilizations were listed in the ledger, and Rook answered with a number so high that translators stuttered before rendering it, clarifying that not all were erased. Some were reduced, some were contained, some were stripped of stars and left alive on single worlds as warnings to themselves, and that this variability was intentional because humanity did not seek uniform destruction, it sought outcomes. He then revealed the greatest secret, the one that finally broke the chamber's composure, explaining that humanity's restraint was not only moral or strategic, but logistical. Because humanity did not fight wars the way others did. They concluded them in advance, running scenarios until every possible ending existed simultaneously. And once the decision to act was made, the war was already over, the only variable left being how much mercy the enemy had earned before crossing the line. As Rook spoke, long-range sensors across the galaxy detected subtle shifts, human fleets adjusting positions, not moving forward, not retreating, simply aligning, a quiet reminder that everything he described was not theoretical. He ended this part of his explanation by stating that the conclave itself existed only because humanity had allowed it to, that more than once in history, a unified galactic authority had attempted to dictate terms to humans, and more than once those authorities had quietly dissolved after discovering that human influence extended into supply chains, energy grids, and political successions long before any vote was ever cast. The implication was unmistakable. The galaxy's peace was not maintained by balance, but by a single species choosing every day not to enforce the order it was fully capable of imposing. And as the chamber lights dimmed slightly to signal a recess that no one acknowledged, a realization spread through every listening mind that humanity's most terrifying weapon was not its fleets or its soldiers, but its ability to wait forever, while knowing exactly how everything would end.
The recess signal finally forced motion, not because the conclave wished it, but because ancient automated systems insisted on it, and as representatives rose in uneasy clusters, the historian remained where he was, knowing the story was not finished because the galaxy still believed it understood him. When the session resumed, the speaker attempted to regain control by reframing the narrative, accusing humanity of manipulation through fear, of cloaking domination in the language of restraint, and Rook accepted the accusation without defensiveness, saying simply that fear was not the goal, memory was. He told them the galaxy kept repeating the same mistake, assuming humanity's ethics were performative rather than structural. And to correct that misunderstanding, he revealed a chapter of human history never before shared outside classified circles, the War of Severance, a conflict so brief and so absolute it rarely appeared in public archives. An ancient machine intelligence collective known as the Ithrex had concluded that biological species were inherently unstable and initiated a preemptive sterilization campaign across multiple sectors, humanity among the targets. And for the first time in recorded history, humanity did not wait for a second strike. They waited only long enough to confirm intent. The response did not involve fleets, did not involve ground troops, and did not involve diplomacy. Humanity unleashed a cascading logic virus designed not to destroy machines, but to force them to optimize empathy, flooding the Ithrex network with simulated human experiences, fear, grief, love, loss, and responsibility. And within hours, the collective collapsed under the weight of its own forced understanding. The machines did not die, they surrendered, and humanity dismantled them piece by piece, ensuring no fragment could ever reassemble, because even then humanity chose containment over annihilation. Rook emphasized that this was the closest humanity had ever come to striking first, and that the psychological cost nearly broke them, leading to doctrines so restrictive that every subsequent decision would be weighed against that moment. The conclave grew silent as he explained that restraint was not passive avoidance, but an active burden humans carried, a self-imposed leash on a species that knew exactly how dangerous it could be, and that every time humanity waited, it was not asking for mercy, but offering it. He looked across the chamber and said that many present had already tested that offer in small ways: border provocations, trade manipulations, covert attacks attributed to pirates, and that humanity had responded exactly as predicted, with silence, with patience, with records quietly updated in the ledger. The historian then leaned slightly forward and said that what frightened most empires was not human power, but human consistency. The knowledge that once a line was crossed, there would be no negotiation, not because humans were cruel, but because they were thorough, because they would rather end a threat permanently than fight it endlessly. Near the end of his address, his voice softened just enough to draw listeners closer, as he reminded them that humanity had stories too. Families, children who listened to recordings like this not as entertainment but as warning, and that those children would one day inherit the ledger unless the galaxy learned to coexist without testing limits. He invited anyone listening to remember these words, to share them, to argue about them, to question them openly, because discussion was safer than defiance, and silence after a warning was rarely accidental. The speaker attempted one final challenge, asking what humanity would do if the entire galaxy united against them, and Rook answered without bravado that humanity would do what it always did: endure, adapt, and respond only when forced, but that such a war would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever recorded, not because of its violence, but because of its finality. As he finished, a secure transmission reached the conclave from a distant frontier, reporting an unidentified fleet probing human space, testing response times, crossing lines it did not yet know existed, and Rook closed his eyes briefly, as if in disappointment rather than fear, because somewhere, far from the chamber, the ledger had begun to update itself again.
The report from the frontier was projected above the chamber, a ghostly overlay of sensor data showing an alien armada drifting just inside a region of space humanity had marked as neutral, but monitored with obsessive care. And for the first time since the session began, the galaxy saw something change in the historian's expression. Not anger, not fear, but the quiet fatigue of someone who had seen this pattern too many times. Rook explained that probing fleets were nothing new, that ambitious empires often tested boundaries not to invade, but to measure reaction, and that humanity's lack of immediate response was usually interpreted as confirmation of weakness, when in truth it was confirmation of prediction. He revealed that every such probe triggered layered assessments running faster than conscious thought, weighing intent, capability, internal politics, and historical behavior, and that the fleet now drifting at the frontier had already been simulated to extinction in more ways than its commanders could imagine. The conclave reacted with outrage at the casualness of that statement, demanding to know why humanity would allow such threats to exist at all. And Rook answered by telling them about the Covenant of Ash, an empire that had once unified 3 species under a single banner and decided that humanity's patience made it an ideal target for a demonstration of strength. The Covenant had sent a fleet twice the size of the one now probing the frontier, broadcasting ultimatums and countdowns, and humanity had responded with nothing more than a request for clarification. When the Covenant fired the first shot, annihilating a human listening post with no crew aboard, humanity responded exactly once. Rook described how human fleets emerged not from predictable jump points, but from positions seeded decades earlier, how Covenant command networks collapsed under information overload, and how their home stars were wrapped in containment fields that prevented escape but did not destroy planets, forcing the Covenant leadership to watch their empires starve rather than burn. The war lasted 9 minutes. The aftermath lasted generations. Rook reminded the chamber that the Covenant still existed, reduced to a single system, its people alive, and taught from birth exactly why their empire no longer spanned the stars, and that this outcome had been chosen deliberately because annihilation was easy and restraint required effort. He then addressed the probing fleet directly, knowing their intelligence services were listening, and stated calmly that humanity had not yet classified their actions as hostile, that this was their only advantage, and that crossing the next boundary would change that classification permanently. Across the galaxy, analysts replayed that sentence again and again, realizing it was both warning and mercy. As the historian continued, he spoke of how humans built their culture around memory, not celebration, how they erected no monuments to victories, but maintained vast archives of loss, and how this perspective shaped every decision to wait rather than strike. He wove in a reminder that those listening were not passive observers, but participants, that their reactions, their theories, their shared discussions mattered, because understanding delayed conflict and misunderstanding accelerated it, and that if they wished to debate humanity's restraint, they should do so openly rather than testing it in the dark. The subtle invitation spread through the feeds, a call to speak, to share, to question before acting, because once action replaced conversation, the outcome was no longer flexible. The probing fleet at the frontier began to turn away, engines flaring as they retreated without explanation, and the conclave exhaled collectively, but Rook did not look relieved. He warned them that this was not resolution, only postponement, because somewhere else, another power would ask the same question with different intentions, and when that happened, the answer would not come from a historian in a chamber, but from fleets already in motion. As he concluded, a classified alert pulsed briefly across human systems, indicating that a civilization long thought extinct had reactivated shipyards beyond known space, a civilization already listed in the ledger under a category marked unresolved. And Rook's final words before the feed cut were that restraint only mattered if it was respected, and the universe was about to decide whether it still remembered how.
The chamber lights dimmed as the alert expanded into a full projection, revealing the ancient sigil of the Karoom Ascendancy burning like a scar across the star map, and the name alone sent a ripple of unease through delegates old enough to remember censored histories. Because the Karoom were not merely defeated in the past, they were erased from common record, their disappearance quietly attributed to internal collapse to avoid explaining what truly happened. Rook spoke their name without ceremony and explained that the Ascendancy had once asked the same question, now echoing through the conclave.
why humans never attacked first, and had answered it themselves by launching a preemptive strike meant to shatter humanity before it could respond. He described how the Karum believed in total certainty, how their doctrine insisted that survival required removing variables, and how humanity, with its contradictions and restraint, had been labeled the ultimate variable. The first human worlds burned under Karum bombardment, billions dying before a formal declaration of war could even be transmitted, and for a brief moment the galaxy had believed it was witnessing the end of a reckless young species that waited too long. Rook's voice hardened as he recounted how humanity's response did not begin with fleets, but with silence, a terrifying, absolute quiet in which every human system went dark, trade vanished, communications ceased, and even their allies believed them destroyed. In that silence, humanity did not rage, they calculated. They mapped the ascendancy's supply chains, its cultural pressure points, its political fractures, and its dependence on a rigid hierarchy that could not adapt once disrupted. When humans finally moved, they did not announce it, and the first sign the Karum noticed was the sudden failure of their jump network, stranding entire armadas between stars as human-engineered instabilities collapsed hyperspace corridors into lethal traps. Rook detailed how human fleets appeared only after the ascendancy was already bleeding, striking shipyards, data vaults, and command worlds with surgical precision, never targeting civilian populations, yet ensuring no leader could pretend ignorance of what was happening. The war escalated not in explosions, but in inevitability, as Karum worlds found themselves isolated, their technology unraveling under countermeasures designed specifically for them, their leaders forced to choose between surrender and watching their empire suffocate. Rook paused long enough for the implication to settle that the ascendancy's extinction had not been an accident, but a controlled outcome when their final council voted to continue rather than yield. Humanity had recorded that vote, archived it, and used it as justification to end the war completely, dismantling the ascendancy down to its last shipyard and scattering its surviving populations among protectorates where their culture could never again unify into a threat. As the conclave absorbed this, Rook addressed the unspoken fear, confirming that the reactivated shipyards belonged to a Karum remnant that had spent centuries rebuilding in secret, convinced humanity had grown complacent. He warned that humanity had never stopped watching, that unresolved in the ledger did not mean forgotten, only deferred. Near the end of his address, he spoke not just to the delegates, but to the countless minds listening across the galaxy, urging them to speak now, to share their theories and fears openly, to spread this history among those who still mistook patience for weakness, because silence had once cost billions of lives, and humanity would not allow that lesson to be repeated. He concluded by stating that the Karum's return would force humanity to answer the question again, not with words, but with action. And as the projection zoomed in on newly awakened shipyards, surrounded by faint human surveillance signatures, it became clear that the ascendancy had not returned unnoticed, only allowed to reveal itself, and that the moment it chose to strike would be the moment restraint ended everywhere at once.
The conclave erupted into whispers, some delegations arguing that Rook's warnings were exaggeration, others staring in disbelief at the display of human patience and foresight. But none could deny the scale, and none could ignore that the so-called primitive species had been playing a game across centuries, winning battles they hadn't yet started, and containing empires that no one remembered existed. Rook continued, undeterred, explaining that the galaxy had misread every human conflict as reactive, when in truth it had always been proactive, a silent orchestration of outcomes where humanity allowed enemies the illusion of choice, testing their moral and strategic calculus before deciding the precise moment to act. He recounted the extinction of the Orvath coalition, a race that had prided itself on cunning diplomacy and preemptive strikes, and how they had attacked a human colony on a resource-rich moon, thinking humans would beg, negotiate, or surrender, only to be systematically dismantled with minimal human casualties and maximum psychological precision, their home systems quarantined, trade blocked, command hierarchies frozen in time until their culture unraveled entirely. The chamber went still as Rook stated plainly, "We do not attack first, because once we do, the consequences are final, and we prefer you alive." The room chilled at the words, understanding dawning that every empire, every council, every fleet that had underestimated humanity had done so at their own peril. Then the twist came, as one of the outer delegates asked, trembling, "But why reveal this now?" Rook's eyes narrowed, and he replied with an almost casual calm, "Because you have forgotten the lessons your records should have taught you. Because someone, somewhere, is watching the frontier and testing restraint. And because when you see the first sign that humanity is preparing, it will already be too late to ask mercy." Simultaneously, deep in the outer systems, sensors lit up with dozens of unidentified jump signatures, ships appearing across sectors that had been considered quiet for decades, fleets materializing not in chaotic scatter, but in precise formations, waiting, aligning, but not moving forward. The conclave's delegates felt the magnitude of what was happening before the projection even confirmed it. Humanity's fleets were alive, awake, and watching, hundreds of thousands of personnel ready, yet silent, unmoving, restrained not by fear, but by strategy and history. Rook leaned forward, voice low but resonant, and revealed that the galaxy had already witnessed humanity's restraint hundreds of times, through catastrophes both public and secret, through wars that ended before anyone realized they had begun, through civilizations that had challenged them and survived only because humans had chosen containment over extermination, and that this pattern had created a paradox. Restraint, misread as weakness, was in fact humanity's deadliest weapon. Then came the final reveal, the part that silenced even the most confident delegates. Across every star system, humanity had established observation arrays, strategic points, and hidden fleets, each one perfectly positioned to counter any provocation anywhere in the galaxy. And every single element had been built to respond instantaneously, yet remain invisible, leaving the galaxy blind to the truth that restraint was not absence, it was preparation. And as the session drew to a close, the conclave received the first direct transmission from a human historian to all species who might be listening, an invitation to comment, to question, to theorize, because discussion would be safer than action, and action against humans was only permitted if one accepted the finality that would follow. Just as the transmission ended, a new signal arrived, this one untraceable and unclassified, showing human ships emerging from hidden hyperspace corridors around a cluster of worlds previously thought neutral, their movements deliberate, measured, and yet undeniably a preparation for war, a subtle but unmistakable demonstration that humanity's restraint had limits, and that crossing those limits, even accidentally, would unleash consequences no species had survived before.
The chamber went silent as the signal unfolded, showing hundreds of human warships in perfect formation, engines humming, weapons calibrated, fighters standing by, and every species present realized in that moment that what they had assumed was patience was in fact centuries of strategy, memory, and lethal precision masked by humanity's moral choice not to strike first. Rook's voice cut through the stunned murmurs, calm, controlled, and chillingly human. "We wait because we can. We wait because restraint is the most dangerous thing we possess, and we wait because we prefer you alive." A dozen delegates whispered frantic questions about fleets, about alliances, about technology, but Rook ignored them, letting the images speak. Alien worlds surveyed from orbit, secret jump points revealed, weapon systems trained not on civilians but on every conceivable threat, and archives storing every action, every betrayal, every attack humanity had endured. He reminded them of the Qatari massacre, the Ithrex collective, the Harum ascendancy, the Covenant of Ash, and the Orvath coalition. All species that had assumed humanity was weak, all species that had learned too late that waiting had been the most terrifying of all preparations. The final twist came as Rook's projection shifted to show one of humanity's oldest colonies, a peaceful planet where children played beneath the sun, unaware that just above them, human fleets maintained a silent shield, warships hovering like shadows across the void, a living proof of restraint and omnipresent readiness. Then, for the first time, the historian revealed what no species had anticipated. Every fleet, every weapon, every strategy had been designed not only for defense, but to allow humanity to survive the first strike from any empire, anywhere, at any time, while ensuring that retaliation, if necessary, would be absolute and irreversible. "We do not attack first," Rook said, voice steady, "because once we do not stop. And if you have respected our restraint, you are alive to hear this. If not, you will not survive the memory." The conclave froze, the magnitude sinking in. Every species, every empire, every fleet that had ever underestimated humans had paid for it. Yet humanity had spared those it judged worth keeping alive, and that moral choice, combined with their capability, created an almost supernatural fear in every mind present. A final transmission flickered across every listening post, a subtle but unmistakable call for dialogue, theories, and reflection, a carefully orchestrated invitation that underscored the lesson: discussion is always safer than provocation. And as the projection ended, the conclave realized something that would echo across every star system for centuries. The most terrifying weapon in the galaxy was not a ship, not a missile, not a supernova generator, but a species that could wait, remember, and respond with precision, fury, and mercy simultaneously. Humanity had never attacked first. Now the galaxy knew why, and it would never forget.